By 1980, American muscle cars were a shadow of their former selves. Government regulations, soaring gas prices, and insurance hikes had already taken their toll through the 1970s. But 1980 was a definitive turning point, the year when some of the last super muscle cars limped off showroom floors for good. These weren't just weak, they were outdated, overstyled, or plain confused about what they were supposed to be. And once they left, they were gone without fanfare. Here are 9 American super muscle cars of 1980 that helped bury the era for good.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 9, the 1980 Dodge Aspen RT, a car that represents one of the last desperate attempts to keep the muscle car spirit alive during the performance-starved early 1980s. By 1980, the golden era of American muscle cars was long over. Federal regulations on emissions, rising insurance premiums, and fuel economy mandates had gutted performance across the board. In this climate, Dodge offered one last gasp of its muscle legacy. The Aspen RT, armed with a 360 cubic inch V8, bold stripes, and aggressive styling, the 1980 Aspen RT looked like a street brawler. But underneath, it was heavy, slow, and burdened with poor quality and outdated engineering. This lecture examines the car's design, powertrain, legacy, and ultimate failure to carry the torch of Mopar muscle into the new decade. The Dodge Aspen debuted in 1976 as a replacement for the aging Dodge Dart. It was part of Chrysler's F-body platform, shared with the Plymouth Valari. Marketed as a compact car by 1970 standards, but was more of a mid-size sedan or coupe. Early on, the Aspen was plagued with serious quality control issues. Premature rusting, poor assembly, recalls involving everything from fuel leaks to suspension failures. Despite that, Dodge tried to breathe life into the Aspen by releasing sporty trims, including the RT, Road Track model, a name inherited from genuine muscle machines of the late 60s. The 1980 Aspen RT wore the classic Mopar muscle car costume. Bold stripes and decals on the hood, sides, and rear. Front air dam and rear deck spoiler, Champs T-tops and chrome wheels. Dual rectangular headlights and a bulging hood hinted at aggression. Sport seats with optional vinyl or cloth trim. A sporty steering wheel and available tachometer. Simulated wood grain and basic amenities. Though build quality remains suspect, overall it looked the part, but performance didn't back it up. The top engine for the 1980 Aspen RT was the 5.9-liter 360-citizen V8, but it was severely neutered by emissions controls. Outputs was a mere 185 horsepower and about 280 pound-feet of torque, and that was the high output option. It used a 2-barrel or 4-barrel carburetor, depending on trim and region, and had to meet strict federal or California emissions requirements. Paired with either a 3-speed automatic, torque flight, or a 4-speed manual, the RT's performance figures were modest. 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 9.5 seconds. Quarter-mile times in the 16 to 17-second range. These numbers were a far cry from the 446-pack and Hemi-powered Mopars of a decade earlier. While the RT name implied road racing chops, the suspension was essentially unchanged from the base Aspen. Soft springs and basic shocks. Power steering was vague and imprecise. Braking relied on front discs and rear drums, typical for the era. The car was also heavy, around 3,600 pounds. The Aspen RT suffered from rust-prone body panels, poor fit and finish, unreliable electronics and emissions equipment, sloppy assembly that made the cars feel cheap and rattle-prone, even when new. Chrysler was in financial freefall at this time, and it showed. The RT was part of an era of corner-cutting and desperation. These issues severely harmed the Aspen's long-term reputation and resale value. By 1980, muscle car buyers were few and far between. Insurance companies hated performance cars, and gas prices made big V8s a hard sell. The Aspen RT sold in very limited numbers, mostly to Mopar loyalists or buyers drawn in by the retro styling. It was quietly discontinued after 1980 as Dodge shifted focus to the K-car revolution, like the Aries, and front-wheel drive compacts. The Daytona, Shelby Chargers, and Omni GLH would represent Dodge's new take on performance. Turbocharged 4 cylinders replacing big V8s. Today, the 1980 Aspen RT is mostly forgotten. It lacks the performance, prestige, or historical significance of earlier muscle Dodges. Surviving examples are rare, often due to rust and neglect. It remains a curiosity, a symbol of how the mighty muscle car was tamed by bureaucracy and bad planning. Number 8, the 1981 Plymouth Valari Super Coupe, a final, underwhelming effort by Plymouth to recapture muscle car excitement during an era defined by performance decline and corporate uncertainty. By 1981, the American muscle car was a shadow of its former self. Once the kings of the street, big V8 coupes had been neutered by emissions regulations, safety mandates, and economic realities. Into this landscape stumbled the 1981 Plymouth Valari Super Coupe, a bold-looking but ultimately hollow performance pretender that wore the clothes of a muscle car but lacked the muscle. This lecture explores how the Super Coupe tried to squeeze the last drops of performance enthusiasm out of an aging platform and why it failed to leave a lasting legacy. The Plymouth Valari, introduced in 1976, was intended to replace the venerable Valiant. It shared Chrysler's F-body platform with the Dodge Aspen. Marketed as a modern compact midsize, the Valari suffered from poor build quality and rust issues from day one. Performance models like the Roadrunner nameplate had been tacked onto Valari variants in earlier years. However, by the 1980s, even the performance trims were little more than styling packages. The Super Coupe was introduced in the late 1970s and soldiered into 1981 as one of the last hurrahs of Plymouth's muscle-inspired branding, despite not offering true muscle underneath. The 1981 Valari Super Coupe looked like it meant business at a glance. Dual racing stripes down the hood and deck lid, Super Coupe decals and fender callouts, blacked-out grille, sport mirrors, and optional T-tops. Wide 15-inch wheels with raised white letter tires, fender flares and aggressive stance aimed to echo earlier Mopar muscle legends, bucket seats and a sporty dash, optionally rally gauges and center console, color-keyed trim and available tachometer. It successfully looked like a performance car, especially to the casual observer or budget-conscious buyer, but its show far outweighed its go. By 1981, most performance engines had been neutered. The Valari Super Coupe came with a selection of underwhelming power plants: 225/6, 95 to 110 horsepower, 318 cubic inch V8, 120-130 horsepower, optional 360 cubic inch V8 around 165 horsepower, though rarely selected. All options were affected by smog equipment, low compression ratios, and restrictive emission systems. 3-speed torque flight automatic, 4-speed manual, very rare, 60 miles per hour, approximately 10 to 11 seconds, with a 360 V8, quarter mile, mid to high 17-second range. Compared to muscle cars just a decade earlier, these numbers were disappointing and downright embarrassing when paired with the car's brash appearance. The F-body chassis was outdated, using torsion bar front suspension and leaf springs in the rear. The Super Coupe had a Raleigh suspension package, which included firmer springs and shocks. Like the rest of the Valari line, the Super Coupe suffered from poor assembly quality, rattly interiors, and rust-prone body panels. Electrical gremlins, body squeaks, and carburetor tuning issues were common. Plymouth's brand image was already declining, and buyers had little faith in its performance credentials by this point. The Super Coupe sold in very limited numbers by 1981. It was too slow for muscle car fans, too crude and thirsty for economy-minded buyers, too flashy for those seeking discreet transportation. The Valari and its badge-engineered sibling, the Aspen, were discontinued after 1980 or 81, replaced by the front-wheel drive K-cars like the Reliant and Aries, which emphasized economy and practicality. Chrysler's focus was shifting away from rear-wheel drive V8 platforms entirely, making the Super Coupe one of the last of its kind from Plymouth. Today, the 1981 Plymouth Valari Super Coupe is largely forgotten, even by Mopar enthusiasts. It's rarely seen at car shows, and surviving examples are scarce due to rust and neglect. Its collectible value is low, but it holds some niche appeal for those who appreciate oddball muscle car remnants from the emissions era. It represents an automotive identity crisis, a car built to look fast during a time when speed was no longer allowed. Number 7, the 1980 Pontiac Le Mans Sport Coupe, a car that illustrates how the once glorious muscle car badge was reduced to a hollow shell during the early 1980s. The Pontiac Le Mans once stood proudly at the center of the American muscle car revolution. In the 1960s, it served as the platform for the legendary GTO, a name that defined street performance. But by 1980, the Le Mans Sport Coupe had devolved into an uninspired, underpowered remnant of its former self, more rental fleet than road burner. This lecture will explore the tragic decline of the Le Mans name, examining the 1980 Sport Coupe's design, powertrain, market position, and why it remains largely forgotten even among loyal Pontiac enthusiasts. The Pontiac Le Mans was introduced in 1961 as a sporty trim of the Tempest and eventually became a standalone model. By 1964, the Le Mans was the base for the GTO, often regarded as the first true muscle car. Throughout the 1960s and early 70s, the Le Mans was available with fire-breathing V8s, aggressive styling, and a performance image that resonated with enthusiasts. But things began to shift drastically after the mid-1970s. Increasing emissions regulations, the 1973 oil crisis, rising insurance premiums on performance models, GM's corporate downsizing and shift toward efficiency. By 1980, the Le Mans was barely recognizable. The 1980 Pontiac Le Mans Sport Coupe was part of GM's A-body platform, a rear-wheel drive architecture shared with models like the Chevrolet Malibu and Oldsmobile Cutlass. Its styling was conservative and boxy, typical of late 1970s GM design. Squared-off lines, a long hood and short deck, vertical grille slats and basic bumpers. Sport Coupe trims added a few cosmetic upgrades, vinyl graphics, body-colored mirrors, and rally wheels, but nothing radical. The Le Mans Coupe was meant to be a personal car for economy-minded buyers, not muscle car fans. It lacked any real visual punch or emotional pull. Despite the Sport Coupe moniker, the available engines were a massive letdown. Base engine, 3.8 231 CI, Buick V6, making around 110 horsepower. Optional engines included 4.3-liter, 265 CI, V8, 125 horsepower, 5.0-liter, 305 CI, V8, 140 horsepower, the infamous Oldsmobile 5.7-liter diesel V8, gutless and unreliable. Transmissions included a 3-speed automatic or rarely a 4-speed manual. Even the largest available gas V8, 305, struggled to move the car with any authority, especially when paired with emissions equipment and a heavy body. Performance: 0 to 60 miles per hour, 12 to 13 seconds. Quarter mile, over 18 seconds. In short, it was slow. Inside, the 1980 Le Mans Sport Coupe was basic. Bench seats or optional bucket, vinyl and plastic surfaces that cracked with age. An AM/FM radio and analog gauges were standard, if uninspired. Despite the Sport Coupe label, there was little to no true sport-oriented trim. Build quality was inconsistent, with rattles, thin door panels, and aging components by the time the car left the showroom. By 1980, the Le Mans was invisible in the marketplace, overshadowed by the Malibu and Cutlass, which sold in far greater numbers. Pontiac buyers gravitated toward the Firebird for performance or the Bonneville for size and luxury. The Le Mans Sport Coupe appealed to few. It lacked style, speed, and substance. The rear-wheel drive Le Mans was discontinued after 1981 in the US, replaced by the Pontiac 6000, a front-wheel drive midsize car on the new A-body platform. The Le Mans name would be recycled later in the 1980s, but this time for imported Daewoo's rebadged as Pontiacs, erasing any connection to the muscle car past. Few collectors seek out the 1980 Le Mans Sport Coupe. Most survivors exist in junkyards, drag strips, as low-budget donor cars, or forgotten in barns. It has become one of the most overlooked and underwhelming Pontiacs ever built. Number 6. The 1980 Dodge Magnum XE, a last-ditch effort by Chrysler to keep the muscle car spirit alive during a bleak era for performance vehicles. The Dodge Magnum XE of 1980 stands as one of the last embers of the traditional American muscle car spirit, trying to flicker back to life in a time when regulations, fuel crises, and corporate uncertainty had nearly extinguished it. Though the Magnum arrived too late and was handicapped by outdated engineering and weak engines, it tried to offer muscle car flair with a luxury twist. This lecture explores the 1980 Dodge Magnum XE, what it tried to be, how it fell short, and why it quickly vanished into obscurity. The Dodge Magnum name was first introduced in 1978, replacing the Dodge Charger SE on the Chrysler B-body platform. Built alongside the Chrysler Cordoba, the Magnum shared many structural and mechanical components. Chrysler envisioned it as a luxurious personal coupe with performance overtones, a modern interpretation of muscle luxury hybrids like the Monte Carlo SS or Grand Prix SJ. By 1980, Dodge gave the Magnum one final year with the XE trim, hoping to refresh its image and spark sales. But the effort was too little, too late. The 1980 Magnum XE tried hard to look like a muscle car. Long wide body with a pronounced front end and flush quad headlights. Aero-styled nose cone and a sloping fastback roofline, borrowing cues from NASCAR-style aerodynamics. Optional T-tops, vinyl roofs, body pinstriping, and turbine-style wheels. The XE version added upscale flourishes, chrome detailing, opera windows, depending on trim, padded Landau roof options. It certainly had presence, but at a time when the public had grown more economy-minded and less interested in personal luxury coupes that looked fast but guzzled fuel. Underneath the dramatic styling lay one of the Magnum XE's biggest weaknesses: uninspired power plants burdened by federal emissions restrictions. 225 CI slant 6 i6, 95 horsepower. 318 CI, 5.2 liters, V8, 120 horsepower. 360 CI, 5.9 liter, V8. 166 horsepower, optional and more rare. 400 CI V8, dropped after 1979 due to emissions laws. All of these engines were choked by smog equipment, low compression ratios, and early electronic feedback carburetors. Performance was disappointing. 0 to 60 miles per hour, roughly 11 to 13 seconds, quarter mile, 18 plus seconds. Even the larger V8s couldn't overcome the car's bulk and power losses. Transmission options. 3-speed torque flight automatic was standard. Manual transmissions were not available. Despite wearing a performance badge, the Magnum XE could not compete with even moderately quick imports like the Toyota Supra or Datsun 280ZX. The Magnum XE used Chrysler's aging B-body platform, which dated back to the early 1960s. Suspension setup. The 1980 Magnum XE offered a luxurious interior for its time. Cloth or leather trim seats, simulated wood grain dash and door inserts, optionally digital clock, air conditioning, cruise control, power windows, locks, a futuristic-looking chronometer cluster with square gauges and electronic accents, somewhat gimmicky. The cabin was comfortable for two but tight in the rear due to the sloping roofline. It felt more like a personal luxury car than a true performance machine, which was the intention but not the expectation of muscle car fans. The Magnum never really caught on. By 1980, fuel economy was a priority. Buyers were shifting towards smaller, more efficient cars. The Camaro Z28 and Firebird Trans Am dominated the remaining muscle car market. The Magnum, though flashier, simply lacked performance credibility. Chrysler was also in financial crisis, limiting advertising and innovation. Dodge pulled the plug after 1980, focusing instead on compact front-wheel drive K cars that would define Chrysler's early 80s recovery. Today, the 1980 Magnum XE is a rare sight. It was produced in limited numbers and had low survival rates due to rust, neglect, and lack of demand. It's sometimes appreciated as a Mopar oddity, especially by fans of late 70s personal coupes. Number 5, the 1985 Buick Riviera T-Type a luxury coupe that tried to channel the turbocharged performance trend, but ended up being more show than go. The Buick Riviera has long held a place in the pantheon of American personal luxury cars, known for its elegance, comfort, and restrained style. But in the 1980s, as turbocharged performance became the hot trend, and Buick began building a new performance image through cars like the Grand National, the brand decided to expand its lineup of so-called sporty variants. The result was the 1985 Buick Riviera T-Type, a curious mix of plush comfort and lightweight performance branding. Despite its name and mechanical tweaks, it never truly delivered on its sporty promise. Today, it serves as an example of how confusing badge engineering and mixed messaging could dilute even the most storied nameplates. The Buick Riviera was first launched in 1963 as a personal luxury coupe with sharp, sophisticated styling and V8 power, a credible rival to the Ford Thunderbird. Over the years, it grew larger and heavier, until by 1979, it was due for a dramatic change. That change came with the seventh generation, launched in 1979 on GM's new front-wheel drive E-body platform, shared with the Cadillac Eldorado and Oldsmobile Toronado. Front-wheel drive, a plush, digital-heavy interior, curb weights hovering around 3,800 pounds, a reputation as a smooth cruiser, not a stoplight warrior. Enter the T-Type trim, intended to breathe some performance into the Riviera name. Buick used the T-Type badge during the 1980s to indicate turbocharged or sportier trims across multiple models: Regal, Century, Skyhawk, and Riviera. It was meant to suggest a more European-style performance edge, in line with the trends of the time. Unfortunately, it was often more of an appearance package than a true mechanical overhaul. In the Riviera's case, the T-Type added a turbocharged engine option from the Regal T-Type line, firmer suspension tuning, special badging and blackout trim, sportier wheels, but these additions were not enough to transform a luxury barge into a true grand tourer. The centerpiece of the Riviera T-Type was its turbocharged 3.8-liter V6, borrowed from the Regal T-Type. Engine, 3.8-liter, 231 side V6, turbocharged. Power output, around 190 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. Transmission, 4-speed automatic THM 440 T4. On paper, the engine seemed promising, especially compared to the base naturally aspirated 140 horsepower V6. But there were caveats. The car was heavy, nearly 4,000 pounds depending on options. The turbo system was early tech, prone to lag and lacked intercooling, unlike later GNX setups. Performance was underwhelming. The Riviera T-Type did get some chassis tweaks, slightly firmer shocks and springs, upgraded stabilizer bars, quicker steering ratio. But despite these changes, it remained a luxury-first cruiser. Steering feel was light and vague. Roll was pronounced. The suspension prioritized comfort over cornering precision. It still drove like a couch on wheels, just with a little more urgency. For all the T-Type badging, it never matched European GTs, or even American sporty coupes like the Camaro Z28 or Mustang GT in driving excitement. Where the Riviera excelled, and still impresses today, is in its high-tech, luxurious cabin. Standard or optional digital dashboard, touch-sensitive graphic control center screen, a very early infotainment system, soft velour or leather seating, power everything, seats, windows, mirrors. A quiet, isolated cabin that made highway cruising feel effortless. The T-Type added bucket seats and a floor console, attempting to mimic a sport coupe layout, but the feel remained very much in the personal luxury car domain. Buyers were confused by the T-Type's identity. Was it a muscle car? A sporty GT? A tech-laden cruiser? Those who wanted a true performance car gravitated to the Regal Grand National. Riviera traditionalists, meanwhile, didn't care for the black trim, firmer ride, or turbo quirks. Number 4, the 1980 Lincoln Versailles 5.0, a car that tried to bring Lincoln prestige to a compact platform and failed spectacularly. The 1980 Lincoln Versailles represents one of the most notorious misfires in American automotive history, a classic case of badge engineering gone wrong. Lincoln hoped to enter the emerging compact luxury market by taking a humble Ford Granada, slapping on some chrome, and giving it a V8. The result was a car that fooled no one, earned scorn from critics, and disappeared quickly, leaving a legacy of embarrassment behind. This lecture will explore how the Versailles came to be, why it was so poorly received, and how it became a cautionary tale in American automotive design. In the mid-1970s, Cadillac launched the Seville, a smaller, more European-style luxury sedan designed to fight off rising import competition from Mercedes-Benz and BMW. The Seville was a success. Lincoln scrambled to respond. Ford's solution? Repackage the Ford Granada Mercury Monarch, compact sedans based on the aging Ford Falcon platform, under the Lincoln name. Thus, in 1977, the Lincoln Versailles was born. By 1980, it was on its last legs. Despite Lincoln's best marketing efforts, the Versailles was clearly a Ford Granada in Lincoln clothing, shared the same boxy, upright body, basic sheet metal, and proportions. Lincoln added a restyled front end, borrowed from the Continental, rear Continental hump on the trunk, haute Didon headlamps, vinyl roof and more chrome, Operation Wire wheel covers, but there was no disguising the cheap underpinnings, especially when customers saw nearly identical Ford Granadas sitting on the same dealer lots for half the price. By 1980, the Versailles was equipped with a 302 cubic inch 5.0-liter V8, making about 129 horsepower, a respectable figure compared to underpowered six-cylinders, but still not enough to make the Versailles feel quick. Powertrain specs: 5.0-liter Windsor V8, output 129 horsepower and 229 pound-ft torque. Transmission: 3-speed automatic, 0 to 60 miles per hour, 12 or 13 seconds. Fuel economy: poor, often under 15 mpg. The engine gave the Versailles more torque than its Granada sibling, but it still struggled under the weight of luxury trim and emissions equipment. For a so-called premium sedan, performance was sluggish and uninspiring. Lincoln tried to justify the price with plush velour or leather seats, wood grain dash inserts simulated not real wood, power windows, locks and seats, padded dash and headliner, optionally CB radio, but the cabin design remained cramped and dated, with cheap switchgear and little to separate it from a high-trim Mercury Monarch. Buyers expecting Lincoln-level refinement were left disappointed. To Lincoln's credit, the Versailles did introduce one notable innovation: four-wheel disc brakes. The Versailles was priced too high, often over $11,000, nearly double a similarly equipped Granada. Buyers were not fooled, reviews were harsh, and comparisons to Cadillac's Seville were brutal. Cadillac had designed the Seville from the ground up. Lincoln had simply recycled an economy car. Sales numbers reflect the failure. Fewer than 20,000 units sold annually. By 1980, production had dropped sharply. The Versailles was quietly discontinued after 1980. The 1980 Lincoln Versailles became a textbook example of what not to do. It tarnished Lincoln's image, associating the brand with laziness and corner cutting. It showed how cosmetic upgrades alone can't sell a luxury car, especially to discerning buyers. It forced Ford to rethink how Lincoln would compete with Cadillac and European imports moving forward. Ironically, the Versailles failure helped pave the way for better Lincoln models in the 1980s, like the redesigned Continental and Mark 7. Versailles models are now relatively rare but not valuable. Most collectors view them as curiosities, not treasures. The most notable appeal is to Ford historians, fans of oddball cars, hot rodders who might use the Versailles disc brake rear end for other builds. Even pristine examples rarely fetch high prices. Number 3, the 1986 Pontiac Grand Prix 2+2 Aero Coupe. A car that looked like it was born for speed, but whose actual performance fell short of its NASCAR-inspired styling. The 1980s were a golden age for NASCAR homologation specials, when manufacturers were required to produce street-legal versions of their race cars to qualify for competition. This led to a handful of odd but fascinating vehicles, and among them stood the 1986 Pontiac Grand Prix 2+2 Aero Coupe. On the surface, this car looked like a high-performance NASCAR weapon, ready to rip up the streets. But open the hood or press the gas, and reality came crashing in. With a sluggish V8 and soft suspension, the 2+2 turned out to be all show, no go, and was quickly forgotten by most enthusiasts. In the mid-1980s, aerodynamics became crucial in stock car racing. At high speeds, boxy coupes were being outgunned by cars like the Ford Thunderbird Aero Coupe, which had a sloped roofline and better airflow. Pontiac needed a response to stay competitive in NASCAR, especially on superspeedways like Daytona and Talladega. The rules required that a certain number of street versions be built to qualify the design for racing. Hence, the 1986 Grand Prix 2+2 Aero Coupe was born. Visually, the Grand Prix 2+2 was striking and unique among 1980s GM cars. Key features included fastback rear glass, a large sloping rear window that improved airflow over the trunk, extended fiberglass nose cone, sleeker and more aerodynamic than the standard Grand Prix, integrated rear spoiler, meant to reduce rear lift at high speed, functional front air dam and flush headlamps, contributed to better frontal aero, monochrome paint with subtle 2+2 graphics. The 2+2 looked sleek and race-ready, but in truth, these upgrades were more about satisfying NASCAR than enhancing the street experience. Despite its aggressive looks, the 2+2 came with a 305 cubic inch 5.0 LG4 V8, an engine already familiar to many GM cars of the era and not in a good way. Out for 165 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque. Transmission: 3-speed automatic, THM 200 4R in some cases. 60 miles per hour, 10.5 seconds quarter mile, 17.5 seconds. For a car that looked like a stock car, performance was a massive disappointment. The engine was strangled by emissions equipment and saddled with a low red line. There was no high-performance engine option, no 350, no turbo, no Dream. Many reviewers at the time noted that even a base-model Mustang or Camaro could outrun it without breaking a sweat. The suspension setup was essentially standard Grand Prix fare, with a few tweaks. Softer springs for a smoother ride, slightly firmer shocks and bushings, rear sway bar added. But the car was still heavy, 3,600 pounds, and tuned more for cruising than corner carving. Inside the Grand Prix 2+2 was almost identical to the standard coupe. Standard bench seat or optional buckets with console, traditional Pontiac gauge cluster with sporty red needles, tilt wheel, air conditioning, and power accessories, fairly typical of 1980s GM offerings. No special badging or unique instrumentation to differentiate the 2+2. This lack of distinctive interior touches made the 2+2 feel like a cosmetic package, not a performance car. The Grand Prix 2+2 was a one-year-only model, built only in 1986. Total production, 1,225 units. All were painted silver metallic with gray and black trim. No significant engine or trim variations. They were essentially built to meet homologation rules and little else. Because of the limited run, the 2+2 is relatively rare, but that rarity hasn't translated to major collector value. When it launched, the 2+2 was met with confusion. NASCAR fans appreciated the effort, but real performance enthusiasts ignored it. Car magazines called it out for being underpowered and overpriced. The base price hovered around $12,500, a steep ask for a car that couldn't back up its looks. Today, the 2+2 is seen as a curiosity of NASCAR history, a rare but not particularly desirable GM experiment, a symbol of GM's tendency in the 1980s to focus on style over substance. Number 2, the 1981 Chevrolet Monte Carlo Turbo, a car that had the right idea but the wrong execution. In the early 1980s, American automakers were caught in a transitional era. Muscle cars had been emasculated by emission standards, gas prices were rising, and innovation was necessary, particularly in the powertrain department. Turbocharging began to look like a possible savior, and Buick had already begun experimenting with turbo V6 engines that would soon power the legendary Grand National. Chevrolet decided to follow suit, albeit briefly, with the 1981 Monte Carlo Turbo. But instead of delivering a performance breakthrough, this one-year wonder faded into obscurity, unable to shake its sluggish response and awkward pairing of powertrain and chassis. By 1981, the fourth-generation Monte Carlo had entered its last year before a major redesign. It was a traditional rear-wheel drive mid-size coupe, known more for style than performance. At the same time, GM divisions were exploring turbocharging as a way to make underpowered engines competitive again. Buick had begun building a reputation with its turbocharged 3.8-liter V6. Chevrolet borrowed this engine for a limited-run Monte Carlo. The result? The Monte Carlo Turbo, a car meant to blend sport and sophistication with modern forced induction. Under the hood was Buick's turbocharged 3.8-liter 231 cu in V6, but with several caveats. Output: 170 horsepower and 275 lb-ft of torque. Turbocharger: draw-through carbureted setup, not fuel-injected like later Grand Nationals. Transmission: 3-speed THM 350 automatic, 60 miles per hour, 9.5 seconds. That might not sound quick today, but it was actually decent by early 1980s standards. Unfortunately, the engine wasn't refined. Turbo lag was significant. The carburetor-based setup made tuning a headache. Heat management and reliability were concerns. Compared to future turbo Buicks, it was clunky and unrefined. Unlike the later Monte Carlo SS, the 1981 turbo version wasn't dramatically styled. Externally, it shared most of its appearance with the standard Monte Carlo coupe, with only minor distinctions. Turbo badging on the front fenders and trunk, unicorn unique hood ornament, turbo-specific wheels and trim, slightly altered grille pattern. To the untrained eye, it looked like just another personal luxury coupe, and that may have hurt its market appeal. It lacked the aggressive presence of what buyers expected from a performance model. The cabin was typical of GM's early 80s approach to comfort and style. Cloth or vinyl bench and bucket seats, simulated wood grain trim, operation digital clock and basic AM/FM stereo. Standard gauge cluster with no boost gauge, a glaring omission for a turbocharged car. The driving experience was more relaxed cruiser than aggressive performer, and there was no attempt to deliver a sporty feel inside. Though the Monte Carlo Turbo had more torque than the base V6 or V8 options, it shared the standard suspension setup, soft spring rates, minimal chassis bracing, light steering feel, rear drum brakes, front discs were standard. The car felt underdamped and floaty, more tuned for comfort than speed. While the powertrain was promising, the chassis simply couldn't keep up, and there were no performance suspension upgrades offered. The Monte Carlo Turbo was offered only for 1981, and fewer than 3,000 units were sold. Why such a short run? The upcoming 1982 redesign shifted the Monte Carlo to a new body style, G-body. The engine didn't match Chevy's performance image. Buyers interested in V8 muscle were uninterested in a turbo V6. The Buick Grand National was about to explode in popularity, and GM didn't want Chevy stealing its thunder. The car was also expensive, costing more than the base V8 model, without offering a substantially better driving experience. Chevrolet never brought the turbo Monte Carlo back, choosing instead to focus on the Monte Carlo SS, which launched in 1983 with a more traditional V8 and much greater success. Today, the 1981 Monte Carlo Turbo is mostly forgotten. Even among Monte Carlo enthusiasts, it is often overlooked. It's rare, but not particularly collectible. Number 1, the 1985 Mercury Cougar XR7, a car that tried to find its place in the mid-80s performance scene, but struggled with identity and relevance. By the mid-1980s, American automakers were grappling with tightening emission standards, shifting buyer preferences, and the rise of high-tech performance solutions. Turbocharging was becoming more mainstream, personal coupes were evolving, and badge engineering was increasingly common within the Ford family. One car caught in this whirlwind of change was the 1985 Mercury Cougar XR7, a vehicle that offered style, optional turbo power, and sporty trim, yet never quite made an impression. Overshadowed by its blue oval siblings, the Ford Thunderbird Turbo Coupe and Ford Mustang GT SVO, the Cougar XR7 ended up as a footnote in Mercury's history, competent but largely forgotten. The 1985 Cougar XR7 was built on the Fox body platform, which underpinned a wide range of Ford products including Ford Mustang, Ford Thunderbird, Lincoln Continental Mark VII, Mercury Capri. The Cougar itself had been steadily evolving from a luxury muscle car in the late 60s to a personal luxury coupe by the 80s. By 1983, it adopted the sleeker aero styling introduced on the Thunderbird. The XR7 trim, revived in 1984, attempted to reintroduce performance flavor to a car that had become more style than substance. The 1985 Cougar XR7 wore a clean aerodynamic shape with soft curves and a slightly more conservative version of the Thunderbird's silhouette. Key features included blacked-out trim instead of chrome, body color grille and trim, subtle XR7 badging, UD-able alloy wheels, optimizer two-tone paint schemes. The look was handsome and restrained, but lacked boldness. In an era where performance cars were becoming more aggressive, the Cougar didn't stand out. It looked more like a Thunderbird Lite than a performance icon. The XR7 gave buyers two choices under the hood. One 2.3-liter turbocharged inline-4, optional, shared with the Thunderbird Turbo Coupe and Mustang SVO. Output: 145 horsepower and 180 pound-feet of torque, paired with either a 5-speed manual or 3-speed automatic. Turbo lag was significant, and performance was modest by modern standards, but respectable for the day. Two 5.0-liter V8 standard. Output: 165 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque, paired with a 4-speed automatic. Smooth and torquey, but not particularly quick. While the V8 was more refined, the turbocharged 2.3 liters was supposed to be the future, lighter, more efficient, and high-tech. Unfortunately, it lacked the punch many buyers expected and suffered from inconsistent performance due to its crude turbo and fuel delivery system. The XR7's cabin was well-equipped, but lacked the sporty atmosphere found in rivals. The XR7 featured firmer suspension tuning than the base Cougar, but was still biased toward comfort, McPherson strut front and 4-link rear suspension, softer spring and shock tuning than the Mustang or Thunderbird Turbo Coupe, slightly sportier steering ratio. The result was a car that handled well enough but didn't feel engaging. It was caught between worlds, not luxurious enough to be a true personal luxury coupe, and not sharp enough to be a real sports machine. The biggest issue for the Cougar XR7 wasn't its specs, it was its family rivals. The Ford Thunderbird Turbo Coupe had a nearly identical drivetrain, but a stronger identity and bolder marketing. The Ford Mustang, GT, and SVO were quicker, lighter, and had true performance credentials. Even the Lincoln Mark VII LSC began offering performance V8 power with luxury trim, eclipsing the Cougar in refinement and speed. The XR7 didn't know what it wanted to be: muscle coupe, turbo sports car, or luxury grand tourer. And in a market full of specialized options, that lack of clarity doomed it to irrelevance. Sales of the XR7 in 1985 were modest, while Mercury continued producing XR7s through the late 80s, eventually moving to a supercharged V6 on the MN12 platform in the 90s. The 1985 version was quickly forgotten. By 1986, Ford was placing most of its turbocharged performance focus on the Mustang, SVO, and Thunderbird Turbo Coupe, leaving the XR7 to quietly drift toward obsolescence.